But good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are in the world. This is an update on social media research. Perhaps one of the interesting things is in 2010, I published a book on this, and when I look at the material for the SMR book, when I look at the material for today's presentation, I'm struck by how little has changed in 4 years, which is perhaps surprising because this is a fantastically dynamic concept. Social media is getting deeper and deeper into people's lives, but actually social media research hasn't moved forward very much. What do we mean by social media research? Well, there are two definitions. There is a narrow definition, which is about quantitative listening to naturally occurring conversations. Going out there, seeing what people are doing on Facebook and Twitter and Pinterest and all of these sorts of places, and trying to draw quantitative inferences. The second definition is much broader. We can do the listening research, we can be monitoring for mentions of our brand, we can engage in ethnography, which is a very human-scale qualitative interaction with online discussions. We can create communities, the MROCs, the insight communities, and use the social media tools as a device for creating conversations. We can use social media as a sample source. And of course, there's research into the effectiveness of using social media for marketing, advertising campaigns, and so on. Today, I'm very much going to focus on the narrow definition, this quantitative listening to naturally occurring conversations. It breaks down into two parts. The first thing you have to do is to collect the data. So people use things like bots and spiders, various software tools that go around the internet, aggregate the information, bring it together and put it in a database. Once it's into a database, then we crunch that with tools, and a large part of those tools have to be automated. If we're looking at 100 open-ended comments, we can do that by eye, we can do it manually. If we've got 1 million comments, we have to use the power of software to help us get through that. And one of the critical issues is how do we blend people and software together really to get some insight of that process. So here's a very simple free tool that's available. It's invaluable. It's something that I'd recommend everybody using, Google Trends. Every time somebody searches for something on Google, the thing that they type in is saved, and we can use that as a proxy for interested in. And I've set this to run worldwide. I've set it to run from 2006 to August 2013. And what it shows us is if we look at the sort of the yellowy, goldy coloured line, which is MySpace, that was really big in 2007, 2008, has been declining ever since. We can see around 2010 the red line, Twitter, bursting on the scene. And we're also reminded that social media, for most people, most of the time, is Facebook. Now that's a real challenge for social media research because large parts of Facebook are not amenable to being researched ethically and legally. But it does remind us that we see these reports occasionally. Facebook is not as popular as it used to be. Maybe. It is still by far and away the most popular form of social media, well ahead of everything else, even ahead of playing and sharing something like YouTube videos. Whenever we talk about doing social media research, there will be a step you need to go through, which is to define a search. This is using Twitter's own search tool, which is a free feature within there. And if we look at what we could do, we could use all of these words. So we might put in new MR training day. So we would only find tweets that had all of those words. We could put an exact phrase in. So training day might be an exact phrase. Finn Raben, Director General, could be an exact phrase. Or we could use any of these words. So we might put in there trade body, in double quotes to make that, industry body, and so on. So we can have combinations and bring them together. We can say none of these words. So let's imagine that we are searching for things about the Apple iPhone, the Apple iPad. So we might say, please tell me about comments that have got the word Apple in. But in none of these words, we would put fruit, salad, banana, because we don't want any references to Apple in the context of eating it. We can tell it that we want specific hashtags, languages, targeted accounts, mentioning these accounts. And in the case of some tools, you can say, we want it located by a specific location. Now, in the case of Twitter, this is mostly targeting those people who defined where they live when they signed up to their Twitter account, as opposed to where they are when they're making a tweet. And so we always need to be slightly cautious about geographic location information from social media listening. However, like life, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Unless you're Justin Bieber, and I guess Justin's not on the show today, or unless your brand is Microsoft, you can monitor your own name, your own company. I can certainly monitor my name, I can monitor the Future Place, I can monitor New MR using the free tools, because there simply aren't that many mentions out there. But all the good stuff costs money. If you want to measure a Nestle, a Kraft, a Telstra, a Singtel, any of these types of organizations, you really need to be using one of the commercial products, the Radian 6s and so on, the brand watches. And these cost money. And if you do a really good job and you monitor your brands globally, it actually costs a lot of money. Hundreds of thousands of dollars typically to do a really good job. And that has come as a bit of a surprise to people who have not been involved in social media listening. They kind of think it's going to be a relatively inexpensive way of doing business. What are the sort of things that you can do? Well, this is using a tool called Viral Heat. Looking at the elections in Australia earlier in the year. For those of you not from Australia, the two leaders were Kevin Rudd, who was the Prime Minister at the time, and Tony Abbott, who went on to win the election. And the first thing we can measure is simply how often were they talked about on Twitter. And what we can see here is that the curves are very similar for Kevin Rudd and Tony Abbott, but that Tony Abbott was consistently mentioned more often than Kevin Rudd. And Tony Abbott went on to win, so we might start to infer that the number of mentions was an interesting feature. But there's more on that later. A more complex thing is to look at sentiment. So here is some more data from Viral Heat. Looking at what people said about the iPhone before the launch of the recent iPhone on Twitter and on Facebook. And this has broken it automatically into three categories, which is negative. People have said something about the iPhone, but it was a negative tweet. Positive, they've said something about the iPhone, but it was positive. And if we look at Facebook, immediately running up to the launch and during it, we can see that the positive surged up, and the grey line is neutral. Most tweets, most of the time, about most things get categorized as neutral. The problem with automated sentiment analysis is that, without exception, and from every single one of the providers, it is less good than we would like it to be. And if you want to find out about it, get a free trial or a demonstration and pick a topic that's quite interesting. So just after a strike, just after an announcement, just after a big cricket match or something like that, click on the positive mentions, click on the negative mentions, read them by eye, and see how many you think are right and how many you think are wrong. And you will be disappointed to see how many of them are fundamentally wrong for a variety of reasons. There is a lot of interesting work going on out there. This is a project from MIT in the US, the Billion Prices Project. They're trying to track what things cost around the world just by listening to the internet and to social media. When people tweet, they pay something for this, or they write on Facebook, the various prices they're offered. They're monitoring all of this. They're mashing it together with an awful lot of computing power. And here's an example of what they've done. So the blue line, this is for the United States, from 2008-2012, the blue line is the official government cost price index, the CPI. What do things actually cost? The red line is the line they estimated by listening to social media. And they look impressively close. And remember that the blue line is not the truth. The blue line is what the government measure by looking at a sample of products, and it's only so many products, it's only so many places. So it may not be the real place either. The red line, for all we know, could be the right line, and the blue line could be the approximation. But that requires a very clear question. It sort of moves almost into the big data area. You've got to have a very clear question, really good access to data, and lots of computing power. Now, I'm quickly going to take you through an example of social media listening that comes from one of my colleagues, Dr. Stu Schulman. He's the founder of a product called DiscoverText. He's a professor at the University of Massachusetts, and he's with me at Vision Critical. And he was looking at a project with several other people. It's a collaboration you can find out more about. I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. About a campaign in North America from the CDC to try to stop people smoking. And as you can see, this lady here has had an operation for lung cancer, for throat cancer. She's got a hole in her throat. There's talking about recording your message to your children before you have operations and things like this. So here is a link. Remember, you can download these slides later. Go to that link. You can find out more about what this project is doing, listening to a large part of social media to try to understand how this campaign is working. It highlights a lot of the problems. So if we listen to people talk about smoking, then yes, they might be talking about smoking tobacco, but they might be talking about smoking marijuana. And Stu makes the point that more people tweet about smoking dope, marijuana, cannabis than tweet about smoking tobacco. We all believe that more people smoke tobacco than smoke dope, but it's less tweetable. So that's where volume starts to be a little bit challenged. And there are so many other uses of smoking as well. You can have food. Evidently, people refer to smoking hot babes, and that is also not tobacco. So a lot of filtering has to be done before you get to the key parts of the data. And if we're talking about this sort of message, it's not enough to say positive or negative, because almost everything is going to be negative in sort of a crude automated sense. So what this project did was it looked at things like fear arisal, a tweet that describes the mood of the tweeter as saddened, frightened, tense, nervous, anxious, uncomfortable, and nauseous. Man, that smoking commercial where the lady has a hole in her throat scare me every time. So that would be fear arousal. People noticed it, they noticed the fear element was there, and it was on target, it got the right message. Then we have fear rejection, a tweet that describes a doubt, rejection, or avoidance of fear-inducing message. That smoke-free commercial is bullshit. My grandma's been smoking cigarettes since she was 10, and she doesn't have a hole in her damn neck. So identifying these two, and if most of the people who talked about the message had been fear rejectors, we could probably assume that the campaign wasn't doing a good job. So what did they do in Stu's project and the collaboration? Well, they blended manual coding with machine learning. Hundreds and hundreds of tweets and other social media features were coded by hand so that the software could pick up a pattern. Once it picked up a pattern, it could then start to isolate items. They started with about 17 million tweets that talked about smoking or tobacco-related areas. They funneled that down to 60,000 relevant tweets. About 24% of those referred to the stoma ads. The stoma is the holes in the throats. So about a quarter of these 60,000 actually talked about things that could be identifiably linked back to the ads. And amongst those, 82% were talking about fear arousal. So they saw the ad and they had the right sort of response. Now, is that good enough? Very hard to say. We can be quite sure that if that had been 82% fear rejection, that we would have felt that the ad wasn't doing a great job. At 82% fear arousal, we can say that those people who've talked about the ad are having broadly the right response. But is that number big enough? That's one of the areas where social media research really hasn't got enough benchmarks yet to give us good guidance. What are the key strengths of this social media research? It's the customer's agenda, not the brand's agenda. So Too much of our research in the market research industry is we ask people a question. It's our agenda. With listening, we're finding out what people are talking about, what's interesting to them. You can find the answers to questions you haven't asked. That's great. It's fantastic for PR tracking, for management of issues. So if something is going wrong, you can start to try to put it right, and you can monitor in real time whether the buzz about your brand is going right or going wrong. Think back a couple of years, the iPhone is launched. It doesn't work for left-handed people. Steve Jobs says, well, hold it in the other hand. People are outraged in social media. You can very quickly see that you're not managing that PR very well, and they then come up with a fix for the problem. So that is really strong uses of social media listening and social media research. What are the weaknesses? Automated sentiment analysis, the stuff that's 100% automated, really is not good enough, and it may never be good enough. It certainly won't be good enough for some time. If you give a whole bunch of tweets to different coders, you'll find that the people code them quite differently. There's often not enough information in a tweet to make a very clear determination. It's very hard to tell who is tweeting. It's very hard to split the data by users, non-users, by one country to another. All of that is quite hard to do with social media listening, and that can be a real challenge. Every time a shock jock says something appalling, social media will often buzz and say, sack that person. If you do traditional research where you ask listeners what they think, listeners often have a very different view to the people on social media who are saying, sack this person. They may quite like it. If nobody is talking about your topic, there is nothing to hear. If you're trying to research white vans, if you're trying to research stuff that you haven't done yet about your brand, if your brand is something that is just massively boring to the average person in the street, then you're not going to pick up a whole lot from social media listening. It's obviously a lot more fun if you're Apple or Samsung or one of these major brands. Separating the chaff from the wheat, as we saw with Stu's example, 16 million tweets that broadly talked about his area of interest came down to 60,000 relevant pieces of information. So we need to make sure that we've got all those extraneous pieces of information removed. There are some significant ethical and legal concerns. The first is, where can you dig? If you have to log into somewhere, you should ask permission. You can't just go around social media digging stuff up willy-nilly. You are going to get into trouble. What can you collect? So not everything that is out there in social media is freely available to you. You need to think about whether or not it's permitted for me to take that, given what I've agreed to when I've entered this site, given the nature of that, given that it's transitory. If we take Snapchat as an example, people do send messages with the expectation it will only last 15 seconds. It's probably not acceptable to collect Snapchat information because there can be no implied consent for that. What can you keep? So after you collect information, some of it's going to be personally identifiable information, some of it's personally identifiable data. Most data protection laws in most parts of the world say you should only keep information for as long as it meets the requirements of the project, the requirements when you collected it, the permission that was associated with it when you collected it. And then finally, what can you share? If that information is going to remove someone's anonymity, if it's going to steal intellectual property rights, then you might be entitled to dig, collect it, and keep it for a while, and read it when you are, as Sue Bell was just saying, write your story, but you probably can't include it verbatim in your story. You probably can't include other people's photos in your story. You can't include things that will identify them. So, 4 ethical rules of thumb. If people have said you can't use it, you can't use it. So if it's in a private site or a private place or in any way there's an indication that people do not want you to use this, you can't use it. It's one of the most long-standing rules of market research is that people can withdraw their cooperation at any stage. If you can't search it with Google, you need permission. Now, this isn't a perfect rule, but it's not a bad rule of thumb, that if Google will find that information, then that's probably okay for you to read it. If, on the other hand, you have to log in, you have to use a password, then you should be asking permission before you log in and have a look at what's going on. Keep personally identifiable data, personally identifiable information safe. Avoid moving it across country borders. What do I mean by safe? Don't leave it on a mobile device where it can be lost. Encrypt it. Don't have it available to everybody in your research team, only those people who have a valid reason for using that information. If your client can search the source you use, don't use an open-ended comment. If I take something from a site, a discussion site, like a Mumsnet or one of these various forums, and I put that quote into my report, the client can take exactly that quote, put it into Google, search it, and find the individual. They can identify which person made that statement. I've removed their anonymity. We're not supposed to do that. Even with permission, we probably shouldn't do it most of the time. So don't include open-ended comments and verbatims if they can be searched and identify the person. So very quickly, in overview, some form of social listening is almost ubiquitous. Every client that I deal with these days is doing something to monitor the health of their brand, mentions and complaints about their brand. That is necessary. It's fantastic. In market research, social media research has not taken off. Many companies I talk to have scaled back. In particular, client-side organizations who used to subscribe to 2 or 3 products in the insight team are now using a much, much lighter touch. They're just looking at key measures. However, we are hearing that other parts of client-side companies are scaling up their social media listening, the PR components, the marketing components. So we have a bit of a worrying split going on where the insight departments seem to be using less social media listening, but other parts of organizations seem to be using more. Social media research is more expensive than most people expected, but that could change. It would not be impossible for somebody like a Google to come along in 2014 and say, here is a free product that does that, rather like Google Analytics did with all sorts of web analytics. People used to charge a lot of money for that. Google came along and produced a product that was free, certainly in the basic, and that changed the marketplace. That could happen in social media listening too. And there are lots of rumors that some of the really big blue chip FMCG companies are about to change the way that they do a lot of business, move away from really long surveys, start using some light mobile surveys in association with social media listening. So let's have a look and see if that happens in 2014, because to use those very, very well-worn words, that would be a game changer. So thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions you might have.